Recently I had one of my students ask me, Mr. G, why do you always wave like this? And the truth is, I'm not really waving. It's an alligator saying hello, obviously. All the other teachers have mascots for their rooms. For example, the fourth graders have got beavers and foxes and bears. Oh my. But for the art students, our mascot is the alligator. In fact, for our art club last year, that was our logo, the alligator. So if you're an artist, and I know you're an artist, I'm giving you the secret wave that is just for artists. And if you're ever walking down the hall or you see somebody and you're not sure if they're an artist, well, just say hello. If they say hello back, well, then you know that they're an artist. So if you're an artist and you're ready, we'll get started. Well, I took a look at your Lighthouse drawings, and the truth is, they're great. What can I say? I'd love to tell you that they're just no good. You got to start over. It's all wrong. But the truth is, they're just too good. Now, don't get all full of yourselves and big-headed, because the real challenge comes with our next step. That's adding color. Because we're going to use watercolor paints. And watercolor is one of the most challenging, one of the most difficult mediums to work with. I've seen a lot of great drawings that get ruined when people add watercolor, because a lot of times the colors bleed into each other when you don't want them to, and before you know it, your great drawing turns into a multicolored mess. However, if you know the rules of watercolor, if you keep in mind a few important principles, you can create techniques and looks with watercolor that you can't with any other medium. Now, with pencil or crayon or colored pencil, even oil paints and acrylics can't create some of the looks that you get with watercolor. But the important thing is to really know what you're doing. So we're going to talk about some of those principles before we get started. Now, you may be wondering why I have two half-finished paintings of Spider-Man. And the reason for that is because I'm going to use these two pictures to demonstrate two or three of the most important principles with watercolor. Namely, what to paint first and what to paint last, and also when the paper needs to be wet and when the paper needs to be dry. So ordinarily, when people work with pencil or crayon or colored pencil, they might be inclined to do a drawing that looks like this and then add color to it. You can do that with crayon and pencil and colored pencil and so on, but you can't do that with watercolors, and I'm going to show you why. I did the black lines here, and now I'm going to add some red paint. I'll load up my brush. Plenty of red, and it starts out okay. However, when that black paint starts to get a little bit wet, because of the wet red paint touching it, you can see how it's starting to create a mess. Those neat black lines that I was so careful to paint with black are turning into an awful mess. Even if I try to avoid the black lines, it's very difficult. It ends up looking very blotchy. Some of these red sections look lighter, some of them look darker, and it's just a matter of time before the wet red paint touches that black and turns everything into a mess. This is what I was talking about when I said a neat drawing can get ruined with watercolor if you don't know what you're doing. On the other drawing, however, I started out by wetting the paper, getting the paper wet, but only putting water where I wanted to paint with the red color. And when you do that, you'll find that the color blends so that you can't see the brush strokes, but when it touches that dry paper, it doesn't bleed into that area. It's one of the ways that you control watercolor paint. And because I did the red first, and my paper is now completely dry, I can add the black on top of that with a smaller brush. Black is a dominant color. It can cover up just about every other color. So even though I have some red paint in the area around his eyes that I want to be black, I can cover it up easily with my black paint. And because my paper is dry, you can see how there's a lot less mess going on here. I'm able to control the black paint, and my black lines are nice and neat and crisp. So it's very important to do the light colors first and then do the dark colors. There's exceptions to this rule. Like every rule, it's got exceptions, but generally, if you keep in mind to do the light colors first and then the dark colors, it's going to help you with your watercolors. Another thing to keep in mind is that you should do the big colors first and the details last. For example, in this painting, I did the big red mask, and then I did the black lines. And I can't do my black lines until my paper is dry. If I want to have smooth colors like this, my paper should be wet. If I want to do detail or something with a very sharp edge, my colors should be dry. My paper should be dry. This right here, this red panel has got dry red paint, and you'll see how I can make nice, sharp, crisp lines with black paint only because I did the big color first, and when that was done and my paper was completely dry, I added the black on top of it. If I tried to paint the black first, well, you saw what happened over here. Even if I decided to paint the red first in this panel, there's still room for mistakes. And I'll show you. Now I'm painting red right here because I want to imitate that box right there. So this part is correct. I'm painting the red first. And if I wait for this to get completely dry, then I'm all set. But a lot of artists get impatient, and when this paper is still a little bit wet, they try to paint black lines on top of it. And if you want to paint something with detail, you got to make sure that the paper is bone dry, because it's just a matter of time before that wet paint and wet paper spreads your paint around in a way that you don't want it to spread. So again, the rules to keep in mind are: 1, paint the big areas first, paint the light areas first, paint the dark areas last, and paint the details last. You can see what happens if you paint the dark stuff first and then you try to add color on top, and you can see what happens when you try to do detail on top of wet paper. Now, if I just keep in mind the rules and principles that we talked about in the Spider-Man painting, it's going to help us a lot with our lighthouse picture, and we're going to be able to paint it just as well as we drew it. And I'm going to start out with my large brush, and I'm going to paint the sky with clean water. And I'm being very careful not to go outside the frame that I've drawn, and I'm also being very careful not to paint anything except the sky. I'm taking my time and I'm making sure that my lighthouse is completely dry, that my ocean is completely dry. And I'm going to show you right now the area that you should be painting and the area that you should be keeping completely dry. It's pretty simple. You just put water in the sky as if the water is acting as if it's invisible ink or invisible paint. I'm just creating a field or an area of my painting that will accept my blue paint, my blue sky color, and keep it nice and hazy looking. If you haven't started coloring your sky yet, go ahead and get started. You can make the paper as wet as you want, as long as you don't paint anything except the sky. If your paper starts to dry out a little bit, you can add more water. If it's got puddles, you can take a piece of paper towel and blot up the puddles. You don't want to have puddles, you just want the paper to be a little bit damp. Now my paper is completely wet in the area that I want to add blue paint. So I'm going to use the smaller brush if it's easier to control, or the larger brush. I like to use a large brush, but that's up to you. The smaller brush is a little bit easier to control. So load up, get yourself about 10 seconds worth of blue paint, and I'm going to go right along the top, and you can see already how that blue paint is starting to bleed where the paper is wet, but not where the paper is dry. If I just hold my paper like this, you can see how it's starting to bleed down into the rest of that wet paper that I colored with clean water. If I just keep working in kind of zigzag patterns, like I said, if my paper is a little bit too dry, if it looks like it's starting to dry out a little bit, you can add a little bit more water. And I'm just making little Z's, like little zigzags, going back and forth. And in doing that, I'm creating clouds in this unpainted area. You can have clouds if you want to, or if your sky is completely blue, that's okay too. But you see how I'm just making zigzags going across. They don't have to be perfect zigzags, but I'm leaving part of the sky a little bit uncolored. if I want to have part of my picture look like there are clouds. If you haven't started with the blue paint, go ahead and get started. If you find, as I said, that there's too much water in a certain area, or if you've gone too dark, darker than you want to go, you can clean it up with a paper towel. So I'll show you what I'm talking about. If I decided it's a little bit too dark or a little bit too wet in certain areas, I can just take my paper towel, place it over the sky, press my paper towel down, and as I lift up, it's going to pull up some of the water and, of course, some of the paint as well. Then I can decide if I want to add more water or more paint. If it's too light, then of course I need to add more paint. If it's too dark, I need a little bit more water. And if there's so much water that I've got puddles, again, all I have to do is take my paper towel and blot it up a little bit. So go ahead and take some time. If you want to have clouds in your sky, that's fine. If you want to have a solid blue, hazy sky, that's fine also. If I want to mix things up a little bit or get a little bit more daring, I could add just a little bit of purple. And again, not much because I want my sky to be blue, but I could add just a little bit of purple. And it'll look even better if my paper is still a little bit wet, because I don't want to see purple stripes. I just want to see a little hint of purple in my sky. That might be a little bit too strong. I'm going to add a little bit of water just to spread that around a little bit. And I think that's about all the purple that I'm going to add. You don't have to add purple if you don't want to. You don't have to have clouds if you don't want to. If you understand the most important principle about making the paper wet so that your brush strokes don't show, about making sure that you've only got water in the areas that you want the blue paint to go, well, that's enough. You've already learned and demonstrated more about watercolors than a lot of people know. And there's my lighthouse sky. Well, my hazy blue sky of my lighthouse landscape seascape picture is finished, and I may be tempted to continue, especially if I have a little bit more time, but I'm going to hold off for two reasons. One is that the paper is still wet, and if I started painting my lighthouse tower and it touched that wet paper and it bleeds right into the rest of the sky, well, I'm going to ruin what I've done up to this point. And the second reason that I'm going to wait is that we're going to use watercolor pencil for our foreground. But if we still have time, there's one thing that we can do today. I'm going to take out my regular pencil, and if you have a regular pencil, go ahead and get it out. And I'm going to put a little bit of detail on my lighthouse tower because I've noticed in most of the photographs that I looked at, that most lighthouse towers have stripes going across. Now, some of them have stripes that go diagonally, and some of them have stripes that go straight across. So whatever you like better or whatever you think you're more comfortable with, that's what you should do. I'm just going to put a big thick stripe right in the middle, and then I'm going to divide the rest of this space right in half, and the rest of this space right in half. So I've drawn 4 lines, which divides my lighthouse tower into 5 even sections. I would say when you divide up your tower, I would make at least 3 lines, but maybe no more than 5. 3 to 5 lines, because you don't want to have a bunch of tiny skinny lines like a candy cane. And it's up to you, like I said, whether you want to have the lines go straight across or diagonally. But if you have your pencil and you're comfortable with drawing these lines, go ahead and put some detail on your lighthouse tower. Well, we did it. We completed our lighthouse drawing, and now we've completed our lighthouse drawing sky with watercolor. And even if your sky isn't exactly the way you want it, as long as you feel like you're a little bit more in control of how to get the watercolor paint to do what you want it to do, well, then it was worth it. And I think that in our next class, when we complete the lighthouse tower and the foreground, the shoreline, the little house, and so on, that's the real focus of our picture. We're going to use watercolor pencils for that. Now, that's something we haven't used before, and I think you guys are really going to enjoy working with watercolor pencils. But until we get together again, stay creative, stay safe, stay cougar strong. We'll see you soon.